Welcome into KSO. I am Mason Voth. That is KSU fan. Drew Galloway here as well. It is a Sunday show on a Monday. Work better for everybody's schedules, and we will be able to go a little bit deeper into some things and just kind of let it all out about what's going on with basketball right now, because I actually think for the first time in a while, this is the most optimistic I've been about the direction of the basketball team. And I think now with everything kind of coming into focus a little bit more, we can all probably take a step back from the anger and disappointment of the way that this season has gone. It's kind of like, last year I would tell people there will be a time to think about and complain about and talk about Naquan Tomlin not being on the team as an excuse. That time was not in the middle of the season. You had to work with what the team had to work with there. So yeah, it should not be February 15th and you're saying, if this team had Naquan Tomlin, then all these problems are solved. Thanks, President Linton. That time was not on February 15th. You had to think about how is Tyler Perry and Arthur Kaluma and all these guys actually going to win a game like this. Now, this year, the time for, I think, being pissed off and having these over-the-top emotions that are not good, I think that's probably gone by. And look, I'm with everybody else out there. I am disappointed by the way that this season is gone. Nobody should feel good about this season. And anybody that, a month ago was like, oh, people need to take it easy on these guys. No, that's part of it. When you fail to meet expectations, you have to wear it a little bit. But this team has worn it now. And I think that Jerome Tang and a certain faction of players are all starting to learn from those mistakes, and they are helping build to move things forward. I think Jerome Tang, over the last couple of times that we've heard from him, has been a little bit more open than usual and has kind of realized what some of his, I don't know if they're mistakes, but things that he needs to rewire himself for moving forward kind of are. Obviously, he realizes that player retention is a big deal. I kind of think they realized that this past offseason, but I think they'll put a greater emphasis on it. Certainly one of the lessons he's learned, and he's not going to say this in the middle of the year when all these guys are still on his team, but there's no doubt that he realizes he's got to be better about analyzing the type of player that's brought in to the program. I mean, he was asked about how tough it is to build a team in the portal after the game against KU, and kind of gave an answer along those lines, just talking about how fast you have to build a roster and, the timing of it all. And I think kind of alluding to that. So I think that there are things to take from what he has said. And then I think Coleman Hawkins is still going to be a positive influence for anybody that is here next year to kind of see how things should be done. David Castillo playing more time and having, a good stretch there in the game against KU is encouraging. So I think that there are a lot of positive things to kind of start to look at and think what comes next for K-State and not worry so much about the present day results, and certainly nothing that happened over the last however many months of really bad basketball that we've seen. Because while they've played flawed teams in Texas Tech and Kansas this week, there have been a lot of things about those games that look better. Maybe not necessarily some of the basketball specific stuff, like shooting the basketball being one of those. But I do think that there are things to take moving forward that are a little bit more positive, and I'll let Drew go from here on maybe some positivity that he's got going forward now.
Yeah, I think that the biggest positive, it really was Saturday, because you didn't see a lot of it on Tuesday. You saw it in his playing time on Tuesday, but he really played well on Saturday, was David Castillo. I think that we got to see the light come on a little bit. He made his first three in over a month, and then had his first multiple three-point game since December 1st. So I think that we're really getting to see him kind of come into his own a little bit. And it went from, I think he was just a little bit overwhelmed on Tuesday to really looking comfortable on Saturday, and was probably one of the five best players on the court for K-State. So that's one of the positives. I think slowly, and I'm just as annoyed as anybody else that it took until January 18th and January 14th to see it. But I think that you're starting to see more buy-in from some players. Like, it hasn't been a problem with like Max Jones or even Coleman Hawkins, but I think that you're seeing it from just a majority of the roster right now. And if you aren't bought in and if you aren't playing hard, like you're not playing. And I think that that's something that is encouraging going forward, because this is kind of just a lost season now. So you're probably playing more for what is coming forward. So how can you get your younger guys to really play and play well and play together, and trying to figure out also like who you want to keep on your roster, because you can't go through another replacing 10 players in this offseason. So those are probably the two biggest positives that I have, and one is on the court and one is off and on the court. So I think that they're getting somewhere. The problem is that they're gonna beat somebody that is gonna be like, holy crap, how'd they win that game? But still could lose to like Oklahoma State at home or at Utah.
Yeah, well, I kind of think at this point, the way we've seen the Big 12 play out, there are probably only two teams that you view as I see no world where K-State should beat them, and that would be Houston and Iowa State. And, the Iowa State thing's totally different because you're going to get them at home, and that's a whole different beast in itself. Houston, obviously, you won't see again, and we saw K-State had no chance of beating them. But, it's not going to be surprising to me if KU comes to town next month and K-State wins that game, because KU is a good team. Like that, the curve that Kansas is graded on is far different from everybody else. This is a bad Kansas team relative to what Kansas should be and has been under Bill Self. And I think the most astute, and, if there are any of them out there, the smart Kansas fans, I think they realize that. I've seen a couple of them that I would put some stock into, and I don't know if I respect them, but I respect what they've said and how they've approached it to kind of lay out, like, here's why people are so down about these last two Kansas teams this year and last year. And it kind of goes to show something. You're like, yeah, this is not what Kansas should be. But K-State will have every opportunity to beat them, especially if, some of the things that we've seen over the last little bit continue to improve. And obviously, David Castillo is probably going to be, that should be the guy that K-State fans focus on the most over the next 2 months, is seeing how he finishes out this season. If it goes poorly, I wouldn't write him off. But if it goes well, you should feel really good about it. And how David Castillo plays should dictate your mood over the last 2 months of this season, if you're a K-State basketball fan. Or, another one would be if Doug McDaniel gets this thing figured out and it seems like there's more from him, and then it's starting to look like maybe he'd be a more viable candidate to return next year, and you think that's something that could work out, then I'm sure you could get some good stuff out of that. But there's just so few of those guys that I think are going to be back next year. Some because they can't come back. Like we know David Gasson and Coleman Hawkins can't come back. If they could, you would, if they had more eligibility, you would certainly welcome them coming back. But it's not a possibility there. So, Fan, in terms of what you've seen over, this weekend, everything kind of leading up the last couple of weeks, where do you stand on the direction of this team right now?
I would agree that you're past the point of, your low point probably as a fan for this season probably came Oklahoma State, Houston games where K-State just really didn't compete the way you would expect them to compete. And now you have to look for, I think Drew pointed out, buy-in and culture. And this week there have been positive signs, even though they were both losses. And while you don't celebrate building culture and getting buy-in in mid-January, you do look for signs that this staff can still do it. And that's what I'm looking for right now, is that this staff can still get these guys bought in. And probably now is tougher than ever because these guys know these guys aren't dumb. They know it's a lost season as far as making the NCAA tournament goes. And really, the staff is dealing with things they haven't dealt with. I mean, Jerome Tang hasn't been below 500 as a coach since 2007 at Baylor. It was the last time Baylor was below 500 in a season. The last bad stretch they had, I think they lost 8 out of 10 in 2018, and they made an NIT that year. So even Jerome Tang is going through something he hasn't gone through even as an assistant in many, many years. So you try to find the positives for, can they get through this? Can they get some wins to finish this season and get buy-in, like Drew said, from guys that could return? And you're looking at David Castillo, you're looking at Ugo, you're looking at even, it's going to be debated, but Doug McDaniel, is there any way to make him work in this program for a second year? Brennan Hasen has been up and down all season, but I think he's been bought in the whole time. And then you look at others, what's going to happen with CJ Jones, whose playing time has dipped and seems to be kind of replaced by David Castillo in the lineup. And then Bayfall, probably a developmental piece. Buddy Rich has disappeared. So there's kind of up and down even with that returning group on who's going to be back, who's going to play. And that's probably going to continue this season. We'll see how that shakes out. You still got a lot of games left, but the best offensive game K-State has had this year as far as efficiency goes, so that was a positive. Now it was also the worst defensive game all year. So there's a give and take there, but you got to find what you can find to find some confidence moving forward that this team can finish the season well and give some sort of springboard into next year.
It's going to be interesting to see what the next handful of games look like for K-State, because the next three are gettable. Scott Drew likes losing to Jerome Tang. I told Drew that's kind of like the Bill Self Oklahoma State thing right there. It seems like at this point, where for whatever reason, it's just a given fact that Jerome Tang is going to get to beat Scott Drew, because I think Scott Drew likes him so much, and Bill Self every 2 or 3 years is going to lose a game to Oklahoma State that he shouldn't, because he's still got some Cowboy pride in him for whatever reason. So then after that, it's a home game against West Virginia, who's playing really well right now. They got a big win over Iowa State this weekend, and then Oklahoma State before you have to go on the road to Ames at the start of February, which is not going to be a fun time for K-State. But that will probably give us a pretty good idea of where this team's mentality is and what the direction kind of continues to be, how much you're going to get buy-in over the final month of the season in that game, because that's going to be a pretty testy environment for them, not just because it's a good team, but because it's Iowa State. And on top of that, like, it's not just a rivalry type deal. Like in football, K-State and Iowa State fans don't like each other. That is a true rivalry, but I think there's genuine hate on the basketball side now. I think Iowa State fans love to hate Jerome Tang, and then K-State fans obviously love to hate the fact that TJ Otzelberger has turned Iowa State into a top 5 team this year. And to me, they are going to win the Big 12 this year, despite the fact that they lost in Morgantown this weekend. That is the best team in the Big 12. Everything about them is legit, and not just they could win the conference way, but in they could win the national title type of way. So it is impressive what he's done there, as much as it kind of sucks to say that and see that happen. In terms of what actually took place on Saturday in the game for K-State and KU, Drew and I were there, 14-0 to immediately start the game. Some quick timeouts from Jerome Tang, and you just kind of think, yep, this is what I expected. And then K-State showed some good fight and battled back. They kind of whittled the lead down, and at halftime it was a 10-point game. And then K-State started out again. We go back to this. Think to the Wichita State game. Starting 5, brutal start to the ball game. Then that group that was on the floor to close out the first half went on a little bit of a run. Things were seeming a little bit more positive. And then you start the second half with a starting 5. Same type of deal happened on Saturday in Allen Fieldhouse, which is odd because was it the O State game or the Tech game where Tang didn't start with the same starting 5? One of the games recently, K-State didn't start with the same 5 on the floor, but it happened. K-State ends up getting down 15 in the second half, and then they're able to get it all the way down to 6, and it kind of held there. They get to the under 4 timeout the way it was. Coleman Hawkins did absolutely everything in this game. David Gasson had a really quiet 13-5. After the game, I was like, you probably didn't get as much from Gasson as you wanted, but it was a quiet 13 points that show up. And then David Castillo was probably the story of the game, despite the fact that he only makes 2 shots, but it was encouraging the way it played out. And overall should be not a moral victory type deal, but when you go to Allen Fieldhouse, I think most teams are searching for moral victories. the fact that K-State got in that big of a hole that early in the game, and based on the season has gone, that they didn't just completely let it run away from them, and they tried, and they actually made it a game there going to the final TV timeout. They deserve credit for what they were able to do, and that's another thing that contributes to probably more positivity than we've seen with K-State basketball in about a month and a half or more. Nope, fan's muted. He's pulling the me. He doesn't even have a 1-year-old in the room with him, I don't think.
After the first 7 minutes, you can't really do this, but K-State outscored KU 70-64 the last 33 minutes of the game, which is, a positive for if you want to search for positives. But I mean, really, the issue is K-State is so reliant on making 3-point shots. I mean, they missed their first 11, missed their first 7 as KU was building a 16-point lead. So I think that correlates pretty well. That's too many threes. But I think their offense kind of is hope you make threes. Like, that's really sadly what K-State's offense has become. When they went on their run to kind of get back into the game, they made 6 out of their next 12 in the middle of the game. So the number was down. So you're getting more 2-point shots, but you're making threes. And then you miss your last 3, most of those when it was a single-digit game down the stretch. So that's really a key. K-State just continues to get beat in the paint. The last 3 opponents, I think, have scored 138 points combined in the last 3 games in the paint. KU had 46, I believe. So, and really, that second half, Bill Self said, we're going to get the ball into Hunter Dickinson and he's going to go score. And that's pretty much what happened. And I think changing the starting lineup might have helped, but I don't know if K-State has anyone that can guard inside very well. I mean, I love David Gasson and what he brings. He's not a great post defender just because he gives up so much weight and he just really can't handle the post. Coleman Hawkins really isn't a great post defender. And then you bring in Ugo and he does okay, but he was Drew and I were talking off air. He was an elite shot blocker at Kentucky, and we haven't seen that at all out of him this year. So that really limits what K-State can do. And then they're not very good at the perimeter defense. You guys, we talked about before we came on how many open threes KU got early in the game, especially Zeke Mayo, who you knew was going to shoot him. So, I mean, you have that give and take. You do like that K-State cut down the turnovers. They won points off turnovers in Allen Fieldhouse. They got to the free throw line at a decent clip in Allen Fieldhouse, and they ended up making like 63% of their twos. So when they did get 2-point shots, they started making them, but you just can't have those stretches where they don't make any threes and where they shoot too many threes. And then you got to find ways to defend the post, which K-State simply couldn't do in the second half. I think KU made like 76% of their twos in the second half. That's just not sustainable if you want to win that building.
Yeah, I want to ask you about this, Fan. This is about kind of K-State's offense and the way it works out, because now it seems like as things start to get positive for some players and in the direction of everything, there seems to be a group of people that are turning really sharply on Brennan Hasen for some reason. And Drew and I talked about this during the game, and while you want more and you need more out of Brennan Hasen, number one, he's never going to be a good defender. Some guys aren't going to be good defenders. The difference with him is, number one, I don't think that it's from like a lack of effort on his end. And number two, I do think there are things that either he himself needs to realize, his position needs to be better, or this is an area where I think coaching could actually take over, and like they probably need to analyze a little bit more about how are we having him defend guys, because too many times he's starting out there, a foot or two beyond the 3-point line, picking a guy up. And at that point, he should know, like, that's just not who I am. And if a guy wants to try and step into one right there on me and I'm, still a foot or something away, go for it. But I think that's part of it. The other part, though, the most important part with him is the offense, the shooting. He still got 5 off from 3 in the game against KU, but he needs to be able to actually get looks. And I don't feel like this team and the offense is creating the actual looks that Brennan Hasen needs right now. So how do you see how Brennan Hasen's play is currently and what needs to be done to kind of make him a more effective contributor for this team?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, he's a streaky shooter. I mean, 3-point shooters are somewhat always going to be streaky. You don't shoot 40% every game. You shoot 60% one game and 25% the next. And you hope you get more 50, 60% games than not from those guys. And that's what the elite 3-point shooters do. But I agree with you. I don't think we do a great job of running him through a bunch of screens to scheme him open, or other sets that they could use to scheme him open, to get him looks. I thought they did a pretty good job. The one he missed late against Texas Tech was a great schemed look to get him a shot, and he just missed it. And you'd like to see more of that. And I also think you see elite defensive coaches just find ways to out scheme us. Bill Self did that. I mean, he's going to out scheme, and he's going to make other people beat KU, and they're not going to be able to do that. And I think we saw a little bit of that. And the defensive side, yes, I agree. The issue is he gets too far out and can't stay in front of guys. And we switch so much. Teams run their offense to get Housen switched on who they want, and then they attack him. We see that over and over. Texas Tech did that a lot against us. So that's another issue. So again, those are things you can cover up if everyone else around him is better. And I think part of the issue is, especially on the perimeter, we don't have good enough guards to cover that up. Our top three kind of ball handling guards I would consider would be Doug McDaniel, CJ Jones, David Castillo. And those three just aren't efficient enough and aren't good enough in other areas to make Brendan Housen better, and vice versa. So you just run into issues when you just don't have enough good players, and K-State doesn't have enough good players as well. So it's kind of a combination of not enough talent really that can really make plays, and then not enough scheme to get him the shots we need.
All right, Drew, I'll ask you about probably the most positive development from the game for K-State on Saturday, and that was David Castillo, and mainly the stretch that he had in the second half. A couple of notes on Castillo. The biggest being that the 23 minutes he played, those are the most that he's played in a game this season and for his young career at this point. To me, that is a big deal. Back-to-back games with 20 minutes of playing time. When you go back and look at the four prior to that to start Big 12 play, it was 9, 5, 4, and 5. And then the only other time that he had cracked 20 minutes this year was in the game against Wichita State, which that was the stretch where it was kind of baffling that he played so much, because he was really bad in that game. And at that stage of the season, you're still kind of like, you get this game, you start Big 12 play fresh, like there's still this path. And then he, the next four, like I just said, he didn't even crack double-digit minutes. So it kind of didn't make sense there. Now this is what K-State season needs to be. It needs to be this amount of time for Castillo out there. He knocks down 2 threes in the game, which, he's supposed to be a great shooter coming in. I think we'll still see that. He had 5 that he made against Pine Bluff, but outside of that, no other game this year he had made more than 1, and a lot of times there were a lot of offers in there. So what did you see from David Castillo on Saturday, Drew?
Yeah, I saw before even the shots were falling that he was one of the better defenders that K-State had. He had active hands, was trying to get in passing lanes, got a couple steals that led to easy buckets. So I think on that end, I was just as encouraged as him making shots, because as we know, David Castillo is not a big guy as a guard. So to see him be able to guard pretty decent against KU was encouraging. Then he knocks down 2 shots, and you're feeling really good about how he played. So I think that we really saw him take a step in the right direction. Now, can you do it again against another team that's going to have bigger guards, but a much worse defense on Wednesday? So this is where, like you guys were talking, like Brendan Housen doesn't get very many open looks. I can probably count on one hand the amount of open looks that have came off of like a schemed up play for anybody really this season. And I think that's the bigger problem here. But as far as Saturday goes, also, like, you're not beating KU in Allen Fieldhouse if DeJuan Harris has 15 points or AJ Storr has 7. So like that's just going to sink you, and those two combined for 22. You're also not going to win when you let Zeke Mayo go 3 for 3 from 3 in the first 4 minutes. But I think that the last like 33, 34 minutes were encouraging enough to not say that K-State's going to beat Baylor on Wednesday, but I think that it will be a close game because Baylor has their flaws. They lost at home to TCU yesterday.
And they were up like 8 or 10 at halftime of that game.
Yeah.
I can't fathom blowing a lead like that in 20 minutes to TCU.
So you kind of look at that as like Baylor is a really flawed team. Defensively, Baylor is in kind of a mess since Jerome Tang left, ironically enough. So you kind of look at that game as that doesn't seem gettable from the outside, but it seems like that's a game that could be kind of like this game on Saturday, where it's probably like a 4 to 6 point game going to the last media timeout, and you kind of just see what happens from there. And then you look at the next two after that, like West Virginia is playing well, but that's a home game that K-State could get, and then Oklahoma State. And there are teams left, not even just the good teams that K-State could beat, but there are other teams like K-State can pick off pretty easily, I think. Like Utah's pretty bad. Oklahoma State at home should be a win. Colorado is terrible. And then I think that they could even win at Arizona State. And that's not going to be enough to make the tournament. But that's enough that, like, if they win a majority of those games, you at least feel better. Because as much as people want to complain, and I think that there are people that are like, they could really lose every game the rest of the way. I think that there's going to be some positivity on where K-State ends up standings wise, because if they truly had two of their better practices before the KU game, you would imagine that they keep building off of that, and you really get to see more of the buy-in and more of the improvements, because I think that we saw that on Saturday. Now it's okay, you've done it once, you did it against Cincinnati, and then it all fell apart. Can you do it more?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's strange because the Cincinnati game, like, it did feel like maybe that could be a turning point. I think you're, a basket away in Fort Worth from that being the turning point. I think if K-State beats Cincinnati and then finishes off TCU, I don't think they lose by 20 at Oklahoma State. They still may get beat by 30 against Houston, but I think that they probably start Big 12 play 3-0 when we feel a little bit differently about this. But, again, once a team tells you who they are, you should believe them. K-State has told us who they were all season. None of that did happen. And now it's about trying to figure out what comes next and what matters moving forward. And part of what plays into that equation for me is I talked a little bit to start the show about how I feel like Jerome Tang is starting to be a little bit more open about the things that he realizes that he needs to change and improve with his team and everything else. And then, I think you have to look around elsewhere and find the David Castillo minutes as a positive. And then you go and figure out, okay, who is kind of turned into who can lead, who can be a positive example. I think Coleman Hawkins is that. I know that I was the world's worst person on Saturday for asking Coleman Hawkins about, his decision to come to K-State. And look, he's a guy that for the last 4 years played on a team that played in the NCAA tournament, was winning the Big Ten, went to the second weekend last year. What he experienced the last 4 years are totally different than what he's experiencing this year. So what I was trying to see from him is, like, what does he feel like he has left for this year? What does he have that he can do, and what he feels like this team can be? And obviously Jerome Tang told him he didn't have to answer the question. And look, some people were upset at Jerome Tang for that. I don't fault Jerome Tang for it. I think that he was in a position where he probably thought that it was a predatory question, so he's trying to look out for his guys, and I think most people would appreciate that if it was them, the player up there, or the player's family. So nobody should be upset at Jerome Tang for handling it that way, because I think he just thought he was doing what was best for one of his guys. But Coleman Hawkins, I thought, answered it well. He gave me exactly what I was looking for. And now, look, I wasn't looking for him to say what he said exactly to make me feel better about K-State moving forward. what I wanted to hear one way or the other was, what is his mindset and mentality moving forward? And what he told me was, okay, this isn't one of the guys that you have to worry about. He will be a positive example for a player like David Castillo moving forward, or anybody else that is on the team right now that is going to come back next season. And obviously, by the way that he plays, he's doing that out there as well, having 15, 10, and 7 in Allen Fieldhouse and impacting the game like that. That is a positive. So I think you have that to look at. And now it's just about who else comes along on this journey to getting better and seeing if they are going to be able to be a piece moving forward in whatever way, whether it's just trying to be a positive influence on guys the rest of this season or players that can return next year. That's where the focus ends up coming from. So I would ask you guys then, if we're talking about building the roster for next season, to me, there are 3 main talking points that go into this. The biggest being the personality of the guys that you're going to have on the team. Because over the last 2 seasons, the personalities of players have essentially wrecked your chances of being an NCAA tournament team. You go back last year, you had a player in Naquan Tomlin that got kicked off the team. And Naquan Tomlin's presence, to me, would have been good enough for the difference against Cincinnati last year, or the difference against, I don't know, it was close in Austin. They lost at the buzzer against TCU in Manhattan, Texas Tech. So many games last year where I think Naquan Tomlin probably was the difference and they would have been a tournament team. Then this year, obviously a Chor not on the team after the St. John's game. So you lose a player that you brought in, not only just as a guy on the roster that could play minutes, but you bring a Chor in based off what he did at Samford, especially against a guy like Hunter Dickinson that everybody talked about, going into when K-State landed him. You're expecting him to be a contributor. That has not happened. Then you've had other guys throughout the course of the season that either haven't played or their role has changed drastically from game to game because of not seemingly what they're doing on the court, but everything else that goes into it. So personality is number 1 to me. Second is obviously the ability, and whether that's the actual ability that you possess basketball skill-wise or your ability that fits in with the team and the scheme, that is a part of it. And then number 3 is retention, which we can talk about, like who needs to come back. Where would this view in your eyes? How does it need to look if certain guys come back? So I'll start with you, Drew. In terms of the personality fit, how important is that to you for what K-State does moving forward, especially when you consider the staff that you have here? This is not a cookie cutter type staff. Not every player in college basketball will fit in with this coaching staff, and that's not really their fault. Like some players, I'd probably I would probably be one of them that would not handle the positivity as well. Like you guys would probably all agree, Jerome Tang and I are not personality fits. He's an eternal optimist. I'm quite the pessimist. So I probably would not fit on his team. I would probably need Mick Cronin to be my coach and telling me that I'm soft and that I suck, and having to go see the Statue of Liberty to play Big Ten games is brutal on us and everything. That's probably where I need to go. So all of those things considered, where do you see the personality play next year?
I think that personality is probably that number 1 important thing that, like you said, because I hate using them as the example still, but Iowa State isn't necessarily the most talented roster. Like, I think that they have a lot of nice pieces that really fit well together in what they do, but besides the fit, their entire roster is entirely bought in. Houston is the exact same way. Why has KU struggled so much this season too? They're having their own buy-in issues. You have to find guys that are bought in and are willing to put in the work and play. So that's probably my number 1. And I think that you're starting to see the personality of some guys kind of let them play more and some guys play less. Like, I would imagine that's probably one of the reasons that Buddy Rich and CJ Jones aren't playing as much right now. And David Castillo is, and who knows with Ugo what kind of goes into him playing more or him playing less. But that's a guy that if he has the right personality, I think that they could make it work if he finds a way to be athletic again.
Yeah, I think the issue. I mean, we talked about it earlier. Getting buy-in in January is not ideal. You want that buy-in to happen in November, and you got to go find guys that fit that. I think number one, you got to go find a lead guard that is willing to be 100% buy-in when you bring him in, and be that extension of Jerome Tang on the court. I mean, that's ideally what every coach wants, is a point guard that is an extension of them on the court and can get that leadership quality. I mean, that's what we had with Marquise Noel. Even though I don't think he was great at it last year, that's what they tried to get with Tyler Perry. I don't think he was that kind of leader or that kind of player as a lead guard, but he did the best he could. And that was enough to raise K-State to be a bubble team last year, even with the other roster issues they had. And then we go, you can't have the major misses. You can't have the misses like they had in this year with Achor. You can't have Glover not playing any reps or barely any reps. And then the Naquan Tomlin deal was a little bit different, but that you can't hamstring your roster and have fewer guys to play. And then we talked at the early part of the season, mid part of the season, preseason, we talked about how forward heavy this team was. We have 2 forwards that play, maybe 2.5 with Ugo. Like we hardly have any forwards that are even getting on the court. And so it just makes it even worse. Like you bring in all these guys and then, one of them bails on you and then several can't play and you're having up and down issues with guys that are returning. So I don't know what I don't know the perfect vetting process to make that better, but obviously they need to do something different, like, because it did not work. And especially when your number one target that you had commit before the Final Four last year has been one of your biggest issues. And, that was obviously the guy, everybody sees it. Everybody knows that was the guy you brought in first. And, I thought we've seen some better signs from McDaniel lately, but it's still been this roller coaster with him. And that can't happen. I mean, that can't happen with whoever you bring in to be your point guard. That can't happen. We've seen too many teams in this league hit it on their transfer point guards. West Virginia, Texas Tech, Utah, even though Utah's not very good, their best point guard is a transfer. So if you hit it on your transfer point guard, or you bring back a really good point guard like Houston did, Houston brought in a point guard from Oklahoma, Uzun. And then KU brought theirs back. Iowa State brought theirs back. So the good teams in the league have good point guards. K-State simply does not have good enough point guard play. So that's my number one target. Then the rest of the guys have to fit. You can't have all these misses and guys that don't even play for you and sustain your roster.
All right. So we'll get to the ability part of this in a little bit, but let's talk about retention then. Cause I think I just kind of was under the assumption that I would think of Doug McDaniel being a guy that might move on after this year, but I would say that what we've seen recently, maybe that is something that is getting mended. Maybe that's something that happens. And surprisingly, Fan, I think you might be the biggest banger of the maybe we bring him back, Jerome. I don't think you're saying like sign me up. Let's make sure it happens. But you seem to be giving at least the avenue to why and how it might make sense. So who should be retained from this roster? Because it's a two-way street. Like it's not just going to be K-State wants you back. Like the player has to want to be back as well. Mm-hmm. But in a perfect world, what does retention from this team look like for you next year?
Right now, my for sures would be David Castillo, Brendan Hausen, probably Ugo, how he's been playing lately. Those 3, I think, are nearly for sures for me. I think you keep Moby. I like, what he can bring as far as energy goes. I don't know if he'll ever be a great player, but I think he seems to be fully bought in for sure. Bayfall, we don't know. I mean, if he's developing at what they want him to do behind the scenes, I'm fine with that. Yeah, I'm open to Doug McDaniel. I think these last half the season, last 14 Big 12 games is kind of the focal point should be, can you make that work? I mean, I think that's got to be something behind the scenes that the staff is saying, talking to him. Can you make that work? But I still think even if you keep him, you tell him we're going to bring in another point guard to play with you because we know we need two of them to really be really good in this league, and maybe even another one that can play with you on the court together. But that's contingent on you staying bought in. So that's a more complex situation, and maybe it won't work. I don't know, but I'm more open to it just because he's still playing some minutes. The rest, I've been up and down on CJ Jones because I think he can be a fine third or fourth guard, but his playing time is dropping off. And then Buddy, I have no idea what to think about Buddy. He scored 20 points, but it was K-State's worst loss of the season. So, I mean,
yeah.
How does that factor in when you're the best player in the worst game that your team played all year?
And you made a number of uncharacteristic makes. Like the threes in that game is just that will never happen again. You know, David Castillo, I think there's a good chance that he hits 5 threes in a game in his K-State career again. I don't know that we see Buddy Rich hit 3 or 4 or whatever the total was against Wichita State that took place there. I would view it this way. Castillo, Hazen, and Ugo are the 3 that I would throw out there as like you have to be certain, because the others, like you're saying, it's just so many wild cards. Like, you know, By Fall is a guy that for whatever reason he played a little bit. Like I thought that would be a redshirt candidate, but I also thought that Moby Ike-Garuke would have been a redshirt candidate because, again, at the end of the day, I don't want to offend people out there, but he was playing Division II junior college basketball last year. It's already a big step for JUCO D1 guys that are playing in Hutch to end their season to make the transition to the Big 12 or whatever level of NCAA Division I basketball. But to expect a guy that was playing Division II, like he's not playing against the Blue Dragons or the Grizzlies or, you know, Cali or whoever. He's playing against Heston College and Highland. Like that was the one that was strange to me. I could see the path with Moby, and this isn't an indictment on him. And really, I think people should realize that over the course of this entire season, very few of these guys is it an indictment on them. Like they're just here, they're doing what was best for them. You know, like the fault does not really lie on them. Now, there are some guys that I could point to and say, you know, Achor not being on the team anymore, probably, you know, you can probably call him out a little bit on that one, you know. But as we know, like nobody should fault David Castillo for a bad performance or whatever. Like he's 18 years old trying to play guard in the Big 12. That's pretty tough to do. You know, Coleman Hawkins, again, there is a level that I think K-State thought that he would go to a next step. I expected it too. You get an expanded role. You expect a little bit more. But at the end of the day, he was a really good player for 4 years at Illinois, and he's shown up to K-State and been a really good player at K-State. It just hasn't been in necessarily the role that you need. So my big point is it's tough to tell on a lot of guys, but there are 3 certainties that I would say you bring back. And again, that's as long as the personality makes sense, because you want to retain guys that have the right mindset on your roster. And because Ugo's play has been up and down, like I can't tell you one way or the other if that's his fault, if that's a coaching decision, whatever it may be. But if everything is right there, I would be right there with you on it. The Doug thing, I am very open to. I think this next month and a half will be very telling. But you're right. I think you got to go out and you got to try and find more guys that can fit this thing. And I do, you know, to bring the ability side of this in a little bit, I think this is where you have to realize, I think this last transfer cycle, K-State tried to prioritize the highest end of talent that they could go out and get. It was a very best player available type of mindset that they had. And I thought for the most part it could work. I thought these guys would kind of fit together or whatever. But what it turns out is that like a guy in Max Jones' shoes who could kind of do everything in the Big West, that doesn't translate to the Big 12. And I don't think Max Jones is a problem personality-wise or anything like that. So he doesn't even fully fit what I'm trying to say here. But I use his skill set as an example. I think my philosophy moving forward would be you get the right type of personality for a guy, And then you make sure that that player has a very specific skill set that you know that can translate. And then you try to build your roster like that. And now I do think you have to realize as a staff, you have to make the puzzle pieces fit a little bit better. You're not going to be able to just kind of cram them together and say, you know, looks good. You're not calling Jeff Probst over there to look at the puzzle and thinking you're going to sneak one past him anymore. You know, he's going to see that little tiny piece isn't in the right spot. You got to flip it around. That's where K-State is right now. So I think that you can't cut corners to build a roster next year. And I think it starts with the personality, narrow in on one specific ability that you like from a player, make sure it can play at this level. And if that's the case, I think you're going to start to see some steps in the right direction. And then you got to get lucky too. You know, a lot of these teams that we talk about being really good and they've retained transfers, they've also just gotten lucky that those players were able to make a jump or just, you know, giving you something that you didn't anticipate from them. And I would also say this, to go back to something one of you guys said earlier about how you got to find that lead guard and bring him back, like all these other teams that we mentioned have been able to do. It is a little unfortunate the way timing worked out. And again, you knew what the situation was if you had him, if you're Jerome Tang. But Marquise Noel, no eligibility left, so you only get 1 year with him. Tyler Perry, the crazy thing to think about is if he just was a year later, he's got another year because of Diego Pavia being a baby. You know, like Diego Peter Pan over there. Peter Pan Pavia, as I'm going to start calling him, the boy who never grew up, just wants to be in college forever. He's, you know, now giving all these JUCO guys an extra year. So, like, there is some of that to it where I think Tang may have had guys that if you bring them back, things can work out a little bit better for you. Unfortunately, you couldn't. Now you got to get better about it. And I think they thought they were doing that with Doug McDaniel, because I remember Drew and I talking a lot this offseason about, look, this guy has 2 years left to play. This guy has 3 years left to play. It felt like they were doing the right thing. Again, they just missed on bullet point number one that we've talked about, and that is the personality aspect of this. But in terms of ability, Drew, what are some things that K-State needs to look for moving forward, building a roster for next season? And within that, you and Fan both can hit on this if you have thoughts, but how abilities will impact the style that they play, because I think the way K-State has ran an offense for the most part over the last 2 years has made some people not very happy. And then, like Fan talked about earlier, K-State can't defend inside the paint to save their lives this season. And as you see some of the talent in the Big 12, that's obviously something that you're going to have to focus on a little bit more. So where do you see the ability side of building a roster next season?
Yeah, ability-wise, I think that you still need to bring in guys that can shoot, because that's just where basketball is going. Like, you have to be able to shoot the three if you're going to have any sort of success. I also would like to target more guys that are probably better perimeter defenders, because that's been the biggest issue on K-State's team this entire season has been none of the guards can guard who they're supposed to guard. And then this is kind of like a really specific trait that I'm looking for, because it's just been something that's missing on this roster. And it's, can you find somebody that can get to the free throw line at a good clip? Like, K-State is one of the worst teams in the country in free throw rate. And not just free throw rate, but free throw percentage. And you just can't have that be a combination and be a winning combination. Like, you have to find a way to get to the free throw line more and then make them. There have been too many games, because I think there's like 4 or 5 now, that K-State's free throw rate has been less than 10%. And that just can't happen. That's not a winning formula in basketball right now. So probably 3-point shooting, perimeter defense, somebody that can get to the free throw line, and then you do need an interior defender, at least one, because right now you have 0.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the funny thing is K-State's offense is actually right now 30 spots better than they finished last year in KenPom efficiency, but the defense has slipped almost 90 spots from 25 to 111. K-State's on pace to have their worst KenPom defense since 2000, Tom Asbury's last season at K-State. And it would be only the third time in those 25 seasons that K-State has finished outside the top 100 in defense. So finding some guys that can guard the way K-State wants to guard is very important. KU scored 1.31 points per possession, which was the worst defensive game in the Tang era since he's been here. So, I do want to find the positive signs from the KU game, but then I look at that, I'm like, man, that's not very good. But KU was also one of the top defenses in the league, according to Ken Palm, top 10, and K-State had the best offensive game they've had all year. So that will be my positive spin on the other side of that. But I agree. You got to go find guys that will defend the way you want to defend, and obviously they don't have them this year. Either they can't, or they won't, or they can't, or just not able. I mean, that's where you talked about Max Jones being kind of this iffy guy. He may be our third best player when you combine offense and defense. Because you would say Gasson, you would say Hawkins, and then who's your third guy? I think Max Jones.
Up until 2 weeks ago, you probably would have gone Hazen. Yes. Just because of the scoring, but that feels like and that's the other thing too. Hazen, it feels like is brick right now for a lot of people. He's still shooting 40% from three this season, so like he's still doing his job there. The concerning part to me is that Drew and I, another thing we talked so much about this offseason was K-State and how we thought they had gotten so much better at shooting the ball. Mm-hmm. Last year's team shot 32% from three. This year's team is only 33.4. I think if we had predicted it before the season, we'd be hoping that this team would be more 34, 35 as a team based on what they brought in. And so that's where some of the disappointment would sneak in there. And
that's a fault of the offense. Again, they're not getting open looks.
Yeah. Yeah. And even the ones that are open, DY and I have talked about this some, but they feel rushed. They just don't look clean, The guy can be open, but he's not catching the ball right. He's not getting himself set the way. Like, there's just a lot that's been fundamentally wrong with the way that K-State shot it. And that's why, you can say that shots just didn't fall against KU, because that would be something to look at here. You talk about how well the offense played, and they did it without, they were 23% from three in the game against KU. And some of them were open looks, but other parts of it, I just look at and say, I don't know, this is kind of what this team has been this year, where they've made shooting it from three look really tough. So that's an area where they have to get better. But I will end it on this and say that everything that's been tied in here is about looking forward to next year and what maybe some of the positive could be. I still think that we are in season 3 right now. I think more good than bad coaching has been done by Jerome Tang. I thought that they squeezed about as much as they could have out of last year's team. Once you don't have Naquan Tomlin, which again, they brought in Naquan Tomlin. I'm sure they were aware of his personality and everything that led to, incidents that got him kicked off the team. They obviously would have known that Quez Glover had an injury history. So, you can say bad luck, whatever. Yes, kind of. But I thought they did a good job with last year's team. If everything went perfect and those guys were both available, this is an NCAA tournament team last year, and we're not as freaking out as people are. This year, obviously, things have gone sideways on them because they tried this great experiment in college basketball. They tried to make everything better with NIL, and as we've seen at Miami, that is not the key. K-State is finding out that is not the key. You got to find the right fit. They found the right fit in year number 1. Now, some of it, you had Marquise Noel on the roster still. That helps you. But Marquise Noel looked nothing like that in his 1 year under Bruce Weber. There were some flashes. There were some things to like. Jerome Tang unlocked something in Marquise Noel. Then you think about, yes, were they fortunate with the Keontae Johnson situation that a lot of other teams were not going to clear him, didn't want him? Yes, that is true. But the dude had barely played any basketball over the last 3 years. And he came out and played in every single game, averaged 17 points, shot 41% from three. Like, he was everything that he had been prior to going out at Florida, and then some in the way that he was able to handle it. And then you find kind of the tertiary pieces of that team. They had a personality that all those guys meshed together for the most part. All those guys had a defined role, And that plays into the personality too. Like Desi Sills obviously worked with that team. Ish Masood, like that team was totally together. And what they could provide as players was there. Marquise Newell and Keontae Johnson were all Americans. So obviously they could do a lot for you. That always helps. But then after that, Desi Sills was going to play his ass off and do a lot of the right things. Naquan Tomlin obviously had some serious length and athleticism to him. Ish Masood was going to come in there and it got to the point where he's playing about 10 to 15 minutes a game. And we joked about it throughout that season, but they got him looks for 2 or 3 big shots a game, and he delivered in the games that they needed him to deliver in. And I think he found other ways as the season went on to be a contributor in other ways, despite limitations, because you would look at him and say, not a great defender. Like that, he overcame that, was able to be serviceable when he was on the floor. And there are other guys that played on that team that had their role. It worked out. Cam Carter, David Gasson would fall into that. It all just worked together. So that roster can be built, and I think K-State will be better off if the way that next year's team comes together is more of an emphasis of trying to replicate the personalities of the 2023 team versus the talents of the 2023 team. Because I think that's what happened this year. You wanted all the talent combined that you had on the 23 team, and you sacrificed the important part of a basketball team, which is being a team and having the personalities work together. So that's where I'll end things here on my positivity. I'll give each of you a chance to kind of button things up too. So Fan, I'll let you go first on that.
Yeah, I think you're right on those kind of evaluation mistakes. And I think there was probably a confidence in their ability to build culture despite issues. And I think they probably thought, part of that is what we talked about last year, milking about as much as they thought they could. I think they probably thought, even though they had a kind of a mismatch of parts in some ways, and you had 2 of your better players that obviously you didn't have full buy-in from because they left in Cam and Kaluma. And I think they thought, well, we can kind of remold. We can go get guys that are just as good as those 2 or maybe even better, and we can put it back together like we did to start year 1 and make it mesh. And obviously that did not work. So I think there's some reevaluation from the staff on how to build culture in this era. I think the emphasis on NIL, and, the other thing was that first year, they probably didn't have quite the NIL drama because it wasn't as big a deal as it is going into last year, and then even more so this year. And then I'm sure they look back and say, whoever leaked it, whether it was Coleman, whether it was agent, whoever leaked that, he's making $2 million a year, probably did not help them at all as well. So you have all those kind of things going into the season. Whoever leaked that we had one of the top 5 NIL rosters in the country did not help. And it doesn't help now because they keep bringing it up. Goodman and Sweeney and all those national guys love to bring that up, and I don't blame them. Like, that's going to be a talking point, and it's kind of been the case with a lot of those teams, Arkansas, et cetera, Indiana, having the kind of the similar issues. So that's one thing. And then, one thing we talked about before, there is a little bit more ability to keep a little bit more pieces because you get 15 scholarships next year instead of the 13 we have now. So your 14 and 15 and 13 can be maybe your Moby and your Taj Manning, who we haven't talked about, who apparently loves to be here and not play. So what are you going to do with those guys? Bay Fall, you have a little bit more room for those guys if they want to be here and just be on scholarship and get a little bit of chunk of change in NIL. But those guys really aren't the key. The key is getting good players that can play, and they obviously got to go do that next year in a better way.
Yeah, real quick, before I let Drew go, you make some good points there that, number one, I think this staff probably thought, just because of the nature of their personality and also the way things work, they probably thought last year was about as bad as it was going to get for them in terms of, oh, we don't have the buy-in. These guys don't really work together, and look what we did. So even if we have that, but we have better players, we can go out and make it work like we want to this year and make the NCAA tournament. And unfortunately, they have found out, as have K-State fans and everybody else, it can get a lot worse on that front. Like the difference last year is that, and this is not in any way to diminish, the severity of what got him kicked off the team, the incidents there. But like Naquan Tomlin was not on the team after last year for things that didn't pertain to him with like his team, whereas Achor, he wasn't here because there was a disconnect between him and the coaching staff and the team and everything. And whether it was voluntary and everybody was cool with it, or if it was a, hey, get the heck out of our lives situation, it doesn't matter. He wasn't here because of it anymore. And then obviously everything else where guys are still playing the playing time game. Whereas last year it was Arthur Kaluma early in the season had that. And then he played every game after that. There were, times where you thought maybe Cam Carter or some of these other guys, whatever, it didn't work out. They all, for the most part, though, were able to put it behind themselves once they got into a game and got deeper in the season. That has not been the case for this year's team. So that has obviously gotten a lot worse. The other thing that I would bring up is when you talk about retention and everything, the way that sets up now, it is, I think, and it might be crazy this way because I get it has to be immediate, but Jerome Tang has a little bit of time. This is the other thing that we haven't even mentioned in this show that people should be fully aware of why you need to get over yourself with, fire Jerome Tang and whatever nastiness you want to have towards him. Financially, that's just not going to happen for a basketball coach in college basketball with that buyout. Like Jerome Tang is here for at least another year and probably multiple. And so I think you need to, while you can be upset, you can say, I don't like him being the basketball coach. Okay, that's fine. You have that, you can have that opinion, but he is going to be here. So you got to find a way to try and get on board with that. And because it shouldn't be good for you or enjoyable for you if you're the person that is like that and says, I'd rather see my school suck at basketball for the next 3 years so I can be right and we can get this guy out of here, as opposed to everybody that wears purple should want to see Jerome Tang be able to get this right. Because as we experienced in year one, having Jerome Tang as your coach when things are going right, and even last year to some extent, that is the kind of guy you want to be your coach when things are going well, because he is a great ambassador for the school. He gets people energized. He can get people rallied. Like, there is so much good there that, if I could have the option of K-State being good with Jerome Tang, or, whatever it takes to get to being without him and then going from there, I would much rather it be K-State gets good with Jerome Tang. And I think that's possible. I think the roster retention thing, though, you have to take the time, build your roster, and focus on using that NIL now to keep the good players that you have and build there, and then branch out. Maybe you can fill a void with a piece or two in the portal, but that's, I think, how you build that long-term buy-in, and you get to kind of this roster tranquility spot where, think about K-State football for the most part. Things, I know, again, people pissed at Kleiman, 8 wins, blah, 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 whatever. You're also lying to yourself if you think that's what he meant by all that. But anyways, K-State football has gotten to this spot where the only thing they are doing in the transfer portal is filling holes that aren't massive on the team. And they've become a really good and consistent player in the Big 12 by being able to retain the players they bring in. And I get football is a little different because it is still very high school heavy, but using that NIL to keep pieces that you want, and then you have, some roster continuity moving forward, and you have buy-in. Like Avery Johnson is going into year number 3. Avery Johnson is more bought into the success of K-State football than he would be if he had been in the portal this year and he's the quarterback at Texas A&M and he's a hired gun or whatever. Like, that's not the case for him. This is year 3. He is bought in. This means something to him other than getting a paycheck. I want to play well for myself. Yeah, it's fun to win, but hey, whatever. That's where some of these other teams, like look at Iowa State. They used in basketball this year. They retained the players that they needed to retain, and then they filled some holes with NIL. But none of the guys they brought in transfer-wise, when they brought him in, did I go, oh, those are going to be dudes that light it up for them. And they really haven't for the most part. They've just been good, solid additions to fill out everything. And they've kind of built better depth in that way. Like their depth is better than what it was last year, and they were a fine team. So that's where I think this also goes for K-State is you can have a little bit more of a hard reset. Now, you need to try and find a way to be good next year. But if the trajectory looks up, it feels better, it feels more fun, there's a little less drama next year, and K-State is, it ends up being an NIT season, you're on that upswing again, and then you can retain enough guys that can come back, and then the next year it's filling gaps and you start to go on the rise, then I think that is a good way to do this thing. Now, those guys have to have upside. They can't all just be basically their finished product, Cincinnati, and bring all these guys that are like, okay, we know you're 17 and 15. Why should we think that you're going to morph into anything different? But that's one of the areas that I think needs to be taken into consideration here. Drew, final thoughts on basketball?
Yeah, I just think that you need to find ways to evaluate better personality-wise and off the court. And as much as that I kind of roll my eyes about high school basketball recruiting right now, you still need to find ways to at least land one or two guys. Like, you can't just go over, because it's like you say that you want to be where Houston is at, where you have like multiple guys like David Gasson out there that are bought in and have played for multiple years. But then you also have 0 incoming freshmen. You only have 1 freshman on this roster. Like, when does that happen? So that they need to figure something out there. And then in terms of on the court stuff, just find a way to get open looks for your guys. Like, we talked so many times this offseason about this guy would be the best 3-point shooter on last year's team. There's a reason that's not clicking. That's because they're not in an opportunity where they can get open looks. Like, the open threes just aren't coming, or if they are coming, like you pointed out, Mason, like, they just look rushed. So they need to figure out something there's something missing from like a practice setting to a game setting of how 3-point shooting is going.
Yeah, it's definitely a scheme thing at this point that this team can't shoot it very well because, like you pointed out there, we talked about it last year in the portal, and okay, this guy should have been better. This guy should have been better. Well, basically every guy that K-State has brought in is shooting worse than what they did from 3 last year, except for Brendan Hazen, who's at 39.5% this year. And that's up from last year. He's also doing it on basically 3 more shots a game from 3. So like, he's done it on volume. So Brendan Hazen, but again, he's a different type of player, different type of shooter within that. The killer has been the fact that Doug McDaniel's shooting 21%. You go and look, Coleman Hawkins is down from what he did from 3. Some other guys have dropped off. Some of the volume isn't there for others. So it's just, they're going to have to improve in that way. And when you bring up high school recruiting, and yeah, I think we both kind of made fun of it last offseason. Like, that's just not how this is done anymore. But it's become clear that you can't totally neglect it. And I do kind of think, I don't know that we were in the boat of you just don't do anything with it, but
you need to bring a guy or two in.
Yeah, because the way that I would view this is that high school basketball transfer or recruiting is like buying lottery tickets. High school basketball players, they're like the scratchers that your grandma gets you at Christmas time. And transfers are kind of like, the Mega Millions or whatever the big, you're picking number Powerball. I've never bought one, so I don't know how exactly it works. But obviously, like, you're trying to do something very specific that's almost impossible. And if you do, obviously, you're going to be a king. You're going to hit it big. But there's a better chance than not that you're going to get absolutely nothing from it. Whereas those scratchers, awesome, you just want $100 off of it or whatever that number is. But there's also a bunch of little things that you can get from it. You can win $1 back. You can get a free ticket. You can, that's what high school basketball is, where you bring a guy in as a freshman. Yep, it may be nothing. That ticket might end up in the trash, mean nothing for you. But there's also a chance that he redshirts the first year and he slowly develops over time. And by the time he's a sophomore or junior, you're getting real production out of him. And by the time he's a senior, he's giving you 10 points a game and he's shooting it at a decent rate. Like, there are so many other ways it can work out. If a transfer doesn't work out in a big way, he's either graduating or not coming back next year anyway, and he's going in the trash, and you just wasted a lot of NIL resources and a lot of really fan buy-in resources that you have with it. So that's how I would view this, and why those high school basketball recruits are so important. And this staff, I think, has to get back to finding guys that you can actually obtain. Bruce Weber talked about it. They went to the Elite Eight. They could get in a lot more living rooms. They didn't land any of those guys. And, David Castillo was a great get for him. You got to go out and be able to try and find more David Castillos and stop worrying so much about AJ DeBonsa or Patton Gongba, because you've shown you can't land those guys.
Yeah, where's your plan? I mean, I would just put it this way. Where's your plan B for high school recruiting? I mean, obviously plan A was to go land top 20 guys, and that didn't work out. And it goes back to what I said before. You have 15 scholarships, and you do next year. So you can afford to go recruit number 60, number 70, number 80 type guys that really want to play Division I basketball and may not be ready to play year one, but are willing to stick it out. And you can vet. I mean, kids are kids. They may change their mind, but you can try to vet that and say, hey, this is number 75 player in the country, number 95 player, maybe even number 110 player in the country. But he wants to be at a Division I school. He wants to be at K-State. He fits well with our staff. Let's take a chance on him. He can be number 13 scholarship player next year, and then we can see what happens in the future. And I don't know if they didn't think about that or they didn't really want to do that, but that's something they should have thought about, in my opinion.
Yep. And the other thing too is, like, I think Jerome Tang thought that this could be done because obviously after Baylor goes and wins a national championship, they kind of have that ability. They have those resources to be able to go out and do something like that. But it's crazy, since Baylor has started operating that way, that has not worked out for them. Baylor has gotten worse since they've started going to the one and done, we're landing you route type of deal. You think about, they have been great players that they've brought in, but that was not what that Final Four national championship team was for them. And then you go and look the next year, like they got some more of that. And, I just think that that's something that you have to look at. I get where Jerome Tang was thinking. They were making strides with those high level type of players, but it really wasn't doing anything long-term now for Baylor. And obviously he wasn't there to see it. Like, he wasn't there to live it day to day. He, I think, can just look and see, kind of strange that Scott and them aren't, top 5 in the league right now or aren't winning it or whatever. But I analyze that a little bit more. I think that's a big deal too. So there's a lot that goes into it for next season, but I do think this season is making it more clear for them. I think based on the way Jerome Tang is talking about it and handling it, I think there's reason to be encouraged by what might come next. And certainly some of the players on the floor, David Castillo, Coleman Hawkins, and other Brendan Hazen, guys that I think can either impact long-term, like Hawkins as a mentor and kind of just showing you how to do things, or players that can come back that have the right buy-in like Castillo and Hazen. I think that's encouraging moving forward. So everybody should watch for that and just kind of track those minutes, see if you're getting positive play out of guys. But if not, I don't even know that that's that big of a deal for a guy like Castillo, obviously, who's really young, and Ugo, who has some traits that, like Fan talked about, he's not blocking shots like he could, but we know it's in him. Can you bring him back, get that out of him next year, and be ready to compete at a much higher level than what K-State has this season? So that will do it for us today. Thanks to Drew Galloway, KSU fan, for spending a lot of time on this Monday with everything going on. And we will be back again next weekend. We'll have 2 more results in the books. So who knows? Maybe everything we said that was positive here is thrown out the window if they get beat by 45 in consecutive. I don't think that happens. I think they're going to be competitive both games this week. And I'm looking forward to seeing what David Castillo looks like tomorrow night, or 2 nights from now, because I guess it's Wednesday game this week for K-State and Baylor. So I am out of here with them. I go take care of my daughter, probably feed her lunch, all that stuff. She's been squealing in the background, and then get on with the day. And we'll talk more Cats tomorrow. Drew and I should probably talk some football, because all of the recruits that were making it in at semester, they moved in this weekend. They get to learn what it's like to be in college starting tomorrow. So classes begin in Manhattan, and we'll talk a little bit about the process that they're about to go under. So that'll do it for us. Thanks for watching and listening to the KSO Sunday Show.